An elderly couple stepped into a lonely Michigan gas station carrying one German Shepherd puppy, not to buy him food, not to ask for help, but to find someone willing to take him away. The woman held the puppy against her chest while tears slipped silently down her face. Her husband stood beside her with his jaw clenched, looking like a man using the last of his strength not to break in front of strangers. Near the coffee machine, a former Marine named Ryan Sullivan watched without speaking. The puppy was healthy, clean, and clearly loved. Yet, every time the old couple moved toward the door, he wrapped his paws around the man's leg and refused to let go. Why would two people surrender the last living connection to someone they had lost? And what were they more afraid of, the coming winter or being forgotten? Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories like this one. Late November snow swept across a lonely highway outside Marquette, Michigan, whitening the gas pumps and turning the afternoon sky into a low ceiling of steel gray clouds. Ryan Sullivan pulled his dark pickup beneath the flickering canopy of North Shore Fuel and killed the engine. At 40, the former United States Marine still carried himself with the controlled alertness of someone who noticed exits before furniture. He stood 6'2", broad through the shoulders, with short brown hair beginning to gray above his ears, a square jaw covered by a neatly trimmed beard, and watchful blue-gray eyes that rarely revealed what he was thinking. 12 years in, the Marines had taught him how to function under pressure. A failed marriage after his discharge had taught him that surviving danger was easier than explaining pain. Since then, Ryan had become polite but distant, helpful to strangers, while allowing almost no one to help him. He entered the convenience store for coffee and found something far more difficult waiting near the counter. An elderly woman stood beneath the fluorescent lights, holding a German Shepherd puppy against her chest. Margaret Dawson was 73, small and slightly stooped, with fair skin weathered by northern winters and silver-white hair escaping from beneath a knitted blue cap. Her faded green coat hung loosely from her narrow shoulders. She had the gentle face of someone who apologized even when another person stepped on her foot, but her pale brown eyes looked frightened and confused. The puppy in her arms was about 5 months old. Milo had a thick black and tan coat, oversized paws, and one ear that stood proudly while the other folded at the tip. His deep brown eyes moved constantly between Margaret and the man beside her. A new red collar circled his neck, but the leash attached to it had been repaired with black electrical tape. Henry Dawson stood close enough to protect his wife, but far enough to pretend he was not worried. At 77, he remained tall, though age had curved his back slightly. He had thinning white hair, a long angular face, gray stubble along his jaw, and large hands swollen by arthritis. Decades working in a steel mill had left him blunt, independent, and suspicious of pity. He spoke to strangers with the guarded firmness of a man who believed accepting help meant surrendering something he could never recover. Milo stretched from Margaret's arms and hooked both front paws around Henry's worn canvas coat. Henry gently removed them. "Stop that," he muttered. Milo immediately reached for him again. Behind the counter stood Emma Brooks, a 26-year-old clerk with warm brown skin, curly black hair tied in a high ponytail, and an open expression that made customers confess more than they intended. She had worked at the station long enough to recognize loneliness disguised as impatience. Henry cleared his throat. "Do you know anyone who wants a German Shepherd?" Emma stared at him. "You mean temporarily? Permanently?" Margaret lowered her face into Milo's fur. The puppy licked the tears gathering beneath her eye. Ryan stopped beside the coffee machine without filling his cup. Emma glanced from the clean puppy to Margaret's trembling hands. "Is something wrong with him?" "Nothing's wrong with the dog," Henry replied too quickly. "Then why are you giving him away?" Henry's jaw tightened. For several seconds, only the humming refrigerators and the scratching of sleet against the windows could be heard. "He needs to forget us while he's still young enough," Henry finally said. Margaret closed her eyes. Ryan felt something shift inside his chest. People surrendered animals for practical reasons and usually explained those reasons immediately. Allergies, moving, aggression, money. Henry offered none of them. He spoke as though he were preparing Milo for a death sentence no one else could see. Margaret placed Milo gently on the floor and carried a small basket toward the register. Inside were a loaf of bread, 6 eggs, canned soup, and 4 cans of puppy food. When Emma scanned the total, Margaret searched her purse twice, then quietly removed 3 cans of dog food. "We bought too many," she whispered. Henry saw what she had done. Shame tightened his face, but he said nothing. Emma slid the cans back toward her. "Take them. I'll cover it." "No," Henry said. "It's only a few dollars. We pay for what we take." His voice was not loud, but Margaret flinched. Milo moved instantly between them and pressed against Henry's boot. Henry looked down at the puppy, and for one unguarded moment, his hard expression collapsed into grief. "Daniel," Margaret said softly, touching his sleeve, "please, don't be angry." Henry went completely still. Margaret blinked at him, confusion spreading across her face. "I'm sorry, Henry. I meant Henry." She gave a nervous laugh, but nobody joined her. Outside, the snow thickened. Henry gathered the groceries, clipped Milo's leash on, and guided Margaret toward the exit before Emma or Ryan could ask another question. Ryan followed several moments later. The Dawsons' faded green pickup clicked when Henry turned the key, but the engine would not start. Henry tried again. The starter groaned and fell silent. Margaret stood beside the truck shivering, while Milo refused to climb inside. The puppy remained pressed against Henry's leg, staring up at him with desperate loyalty. "I have towing equipment," Ryan said. "I can take you home." "We'll manage," Henry answered. Margaret's lips had begun turning pale from the cold. Ryan held Henry's gaze. "This storm will close the highway within an hour." Henry looked at his wife, then at Milo. Pride fought necessity across his weathered face until necessity finally won. As Ryan bent to attach the towing cable, a folded paper slipped from Henry's coat pocket and landed in the snow. Ryan picked it up before the wind could carry it away. It was an overdue electricity notice bearing the Dawsons' home address. Across the bottom, stamped in red capital letters, were 6 words. "Final disconnection scheduled for tomorrow morning." Lake Superior's wind drove the snow sideways, erasing the road behind Ryan's truck and pressing against the darkening Michigan shoreline like a living thing. The towing chain remained taut as Ryan guided Henry's lifeless pickup down a narrow county road lined with black spruce and half-buried mailboxes. Through his rear-view mirror, he could see Henry sitting rigidly behind the wheel while Margaret held Milo against her chest. The puppy's face appeared occasionally through the fogged passenger window, one uneven ear raised as though he alone understood they were being followed home by something worse than winter. The Dawson residence stood at the far edge of a neglected mobile home community overlooking Lake Superior. Its aluminum siding had faded from pale blue to the color of old smoke. Plastic sheets covered 2 cracked windows, and one corner of the roof sagged beneath wet snow. No porch light greeted them. No yellow glow shone through the curtains. Ryan parked and stepped into the wind. Henry climbed from the pickup before Ryan could offer assistance, though his knees nearly buckled when his boots touched the frozen ground. He recovered quickly, straightening his narrow shoulders as if dignity were something a man could physically hold upright. "We can manage from here," Henry said. Ryan looked toward Margaret. She was shivering so badly that Milo trembled with her. "The road will disappear in another 20 minutes," Ryan replied. "Let me at least get you inside." Henry's expression hardened, but he did not refuse a second time. The cold inside the trailer was more intimate than the cold outdoors. It slipped beneath clothing and settled against bone. Ryan's breath clouded faintly in the narrow living room. The air smelled of dust, old fabric, and kerosene that had not burned in days. Margaret set Milo on the floor. The puppy immediately explored the room, his oversized paws clicking against the worn linoleum. He sniffed a faded couch, a stack of folded blankets, and an old wooden dresser missing its lowest drawer. "Oh, that will do," Margaret murmured. She carried the loose drawer into the living room and lined it with 2 threadbare towels and a flannel shirt. Her hands moved with careful affection, smoothing every wrinkle as if preparing a cradle rather than a bed for a dog. Milo circled twice inside it, then climbed back out and sat against Henry's boots. Henry ignored him. Ryan crossed to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator when Henry was not looking. A jar of mustard, half a carton of milk, 3 eggs, and several orange prescription bottles occupied the shelves. Most of the medicine labels carried Margaret's name. One receipt beneath the bottles showed a total large enough to explain the empty refrigerator. "You looking for something?" Henry asked behind him. Ryan closed the door. "Just checking whether the power was really off." "It is." "How long?" "Long enough." Near the wall stood a rusted oil heater, with its front panel removed. Henry knelt beside it and twisted the ignition control repeatedly. Nothing happened. His fingers were swollen at the joints, and each movement caused a small tightening around his mouth. Ryan crouched beside him. "The fuel line may be blocked." "I know how a heater works." "I didn't say you didn't." Henry tried again. The heater remained silent. Margaret unpacked the groceries onto the counter. 1 loaf of bread, 6 eggs, 2 cans of soup, 1 can of puppy food. Ryan noticed Henry watching the food without moving toward it. "When did you eat last?" Ryan asked. Henry gave him a flat look. "This morning." Margaret turned from the counter. "You didn't eat this morning." "I wasn't hungry." "You said that yesterday, too." Henry's jaw tightened. Ryan understood then. The old man had not forgotten to eat. He had been removing himself from the household budget 1 meal at a time. Margaret suddenly looked toward the front window. Her expression brightened with such sudden certainty that Ryan felt uneasy before she spoke. "Claire will be waiting." Henry stopped touching the heater. Margaret pulled on her gloves. "The bus gets in before dark. She hates arriving when nobody is there." "Margaret," Henry said carefully, "there is no bus coming." "Yes, there is." She smiled at him, but confusion had already entered her eyes. "Claire called this morning." Milo rose as Margaret opened the door. Snow blew across the floor. She stepped onto the porch before Henry caught her arm. "You can't go out there." "She's waiting for me." Margaret struggled with surprising force. Milo began barking, circling their legs with his tail low and his uneven ears pinned back. Henry tried to pull Margaret inside without hurting her, but his arthritic hands could barely maintain their grip. "Claire is at the station," Margaret cried. "She'll think we forgot her." Ryan moved behind Margaret and closed the door against the storm. Together, the two men guided her toward the couch. Milo jumped beside her and pressed his body beneath her trembling arms. Margaret buried her face in his fur. For several minutes, only her uneven breathing and Milo's soft whining filled the trailer. Henry stood near the window, one hand braced against the wall. When Margaret finally looked up, the panic had vanished. "Why is everyone staring at me?" she asked. Henry turned his face toward the dark window before Ryan could see the tears gathering in his pale blue eyes. Ryan understood that the unpaid bill was only the visible part of the danger. Henry was losing the strength to care for his wife, while Margaret was beginning to lose the map of her own life. Milo was not simply another expense. He was one more living heart they feared they could not protect. Before leaving, Ryan placed his phone number beside the cold stove. "I'll find Milo a safe family," he said. Henry stared at the puppy for a long moment, then gave one reluctant nod. Margaret held Milo closer and whispered into his black and tan fur, "Claire will be so sad if we lose you." By morning, the storm had weakened into fine, wind-blown snow, but the Dawson trailer still held the cold like a sealed memory. Ryan returned after sunrise with groceries, heating fuel, and a compact electric heater strapped into his truck. He had spent the night telling himself he was only completing a practical favor. The lie became harder to believe when Milo began barking before Ryan reached the porch. The puppy burst through the doorway when Margaret opened it, skidded across the icy step, and planted his oversized paws against Ryan's coat. Then he ran back to Henry and stared between the two men, as if refusing to let either leave. Henry stood beside the kitchen table in a gray thermal shirt, his white hair uncombed and his angular face sharpened by exhaustion. "What is all this?" "Breakfast, fuel, and a heater that works. I didn't ask for charity. It isn't charity." "Then take it back." Ryan carried my heater inside anyway. Henry's pride turned to anger, because anger felt safer than gratitude. Ryan recognized the defense. He had hidden behind it for years. Margaret sat beneath 2 blankets with Milo pressed against her hip. Purple shadows darkened the skin beneath her gentle brown eyes. She watched the men argue until her expression tightened with weariness. "Claire used to do that," she said. Both men stopped. "She would bring groceries, pretend she bought too much, and leave them in our kitchen. Ryan sat across from her. Claire was the girl you were looking for last night? Our granddaughter, Margaret said. Our only one. Claire Dawson had been 21, tall and slender, with freckled fair skin, long auburn hair, and bright green eyes that made every private joke look dangerous. She had inherited Henry's stubbornness, but none of his silence. After losing her mother to illness at 13, Claire became fiercely protective of her grandparents, visiting every weekend and refusing to let their pride frighten her away. A framed photograph stood beside Margaret. Claire wore muddy jeans and a yellow sweatshirt, laughing while a much smaller Milo twisted in her arms. She found him at a rescue farm south of Escanaba, Margaret said. He was the last puppy left. One ear wouldn't stand, so people kept choosing the prettier ones. Henry looked toward the window. Claire said defective ears built character. She also said Milo might soften your face before it became permanently stuck, Margaret added. Ryan glanced at Henry. Did it work? No. Milo sneezed beneath the table. Margaret laughed, and even Henry's mouth twitched before grief reclaimed it. The accident happened 2 months earlier on an icy county road. A delivery van crossed the center line near a blind curve. Claire died before the ambulance reached Marquette. Milo survived inside a secured travel crate. He became the final living creature Claire had held that morning. After the funeral, Margaret's confusion worsened. She forgot appointments, misplaced medicine, and sometimes set the table for Claire. Henry began sleeping lightly, afraid his wife might wander outside. He also began calculating how long he could continue protecting her. I'm 77, Henry said. My hands barely work. If I die first, she may not remember where the road ends. Who feeds the dog then? Ryan finally understood. Henry was not abandoning Milo. He was trying to solve his own death before it arrived. My wife left 3 years after I came home, Ryan said. Not because I hurt her, because I treated every problem like something I had to survive alone. I thought needing people made me weak. Henry studied him. And what did you learn? Ryan looked at the heater warming the room, then at Margaret, holding the last living connection to her granddaughter. That pride and loneliness are sometimes the same fear wearing different uniforms. The words did not soften Henry, but they made him listen. For the first time since Ryan had met him, the old man did not immediately reject what another person offered. That afternoon, Ryan called a farm outside Negaunee. Linda and Paul Mercer, a married couple in their early 60s, agreed to meet Milo the following morning. Linda was a short, silver-haired retired veterinary technician with a calm voice and practical kindness shaped by decades of caring for frightened animals. Paul was a broad, bearded former school custodian with weathered cheeks, patient eyes, and a preference for animals over crowded rooms. They had fenced land, a heated barn, and years of experience with German shepherds. Margaret cried quietly when Ryan told her. She did not argue. She kissed Milo's forehead and said a safe home was what Claire would have wanted. Henry only nodded, but his swollen hands closed tightly around the edge of the table. That night, Milo ignored the bed beside Margaret's couch. He crossed the dark trailer, circled beneath Henry's chair, and lowered his head onto the old man's worn boots. Henry stared down at him for a long time, but did not tell him to move. Heavy lake-effect snow arrived before dawn, swallowing the road beyond the trailer and turning the windows into pale, trembling mirrors. Margaret sat on the couch with Milo between her knees, brushing his black and tan coat in slow, careful strokes. The puppy had grown used to her touch and normally leaned into the brush, but that morning he remained stiff, his deep brown eyes moving repeatedly toward the front door. Margaret spoke to him as though preparing a child for his first day of school. She told him to behave, not to chase chickens, and not to steal food from strangers, even if they looked generous. Her voice stayed light, but her fingers shook whenever they reached the fur beneath his collar. From a small wooden box, she removed the red leather collar Claire had bought for him. The brass tag was scratched along one edge, and Claire's phone number still appeared beneath Milo's name. Margaret polished the tag with the corner of her sleeve before fastening it around his neck. There, she whispered. Now they'll know you belong to someone. Henry stood beside the kitchen window with his arms folded across his chest. He had shaved, though a shadow of white stubble remained along his long jaw. And he wore the dark canvas coat Milo had clung to at the gas station. He had said almost nothing since waking. Whenever Margaret addressed him, he answered with a grunt or a single word. Ryan understood the performance. Henry was not watching the snow. He was using the glass to avoid looking at the dog. If he turned around and saw Milo wearing Claire's collar, the decision might collapse. Ryan had parked as close to the porch as the drifting snow allowed. He carried Milo's small bag to the truck. Food, a rubber ball scarred by puppy teeth, the old flannel shirt from his makeshift bed, and a faded wool scarf Henry had unknowingly left beside the chair. Margaret followed Ryan outside, holding Milo so tightly that the puppy's front legs rested across her shoulder. At the truck, she kissed the soft fur between his uneven ears again and again. "You be good," she said. "You hear me? Be good for Claire." Ryan did not correct her. Milo licked her chin and twisted his body toward the trailer. Henry remained behind the window, a dark, motionless shape framed by plastic sheeting. Ryan gently lifted Milo into the passenger side. The puppy immediately stood with both paws against the glass. Margaret raised one hand. Henry did not move. As Ryan pulled away, Milo turned in circles on the seat, looking through the windshield, then the side window, then over his shoulder toward the shrinking trailer. He did not touch the food Ryan offered. He refused to lie down. A soft whine escaped him whenever the home disappeared behind trees, and each time the road curved, he searched for it again. The drive toward the Mercer farm should have taken 40 minutes, but snowplows had not yet cleared the county roads. Ryan drove slowly through white fields and dark rows of pine, while Milo remained upright beside him, trembling from something that had nothing to do with cold. At a four-way intersection outside Negaunee, the traffic light flashed red above an empty road. Ryan stopped and reached toward the puppy. "They're good people," he said. "You'll have land, a warm barn, more food than you can finish." Milo ignored him. Instead, he pushed his muzzle into the bag behind the seat and began pulling. Ryan expected the rubber ball, but the puppy dragged out Henry's wool scarf. It smelled faintly of smoke, metal, and the peppermint soap Margaret bought when it was discounted. Milo gathered the scarf between his front paws, pressed his face into it, and released a low, broken sound. Ryan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had spent years believing responsible choices were always the painful ones. That belief had helped him endure combat, then destroyed his marriage. He had watched Henry apply the same rule to Milo. Love meant preparing for loss before loss arrived. But Milo did not understand future illnesses, unpaid bills, or Henry's fear of dying first. The puppy understood only that the man he had chosen had disappeared. Ryan stared at the green highway sign pointing toward the Mercer farm. Then he looked at Milo clutching the scarf as if it were the last solid thing in the world. "This isn't your decision," Ryan murmured. Milo lifted his eyes toward him. Ryan exhaled and turned the truck around. Back at the trailer, the silence had changed. After Ryan left, Margaret sat beside the heater until exhaustion pulled her into a shallow sleep. Henry remained at the window long after the truck vanished, telling himself the empty road meant Milo was safe. When Margaret woke, she looked around the living room and frowned. "Where is he?" Henry did not answer quickly enough. She stood and searched behind the couch, beneath the kitchen table, and inside the bedroom. "Claire?" she called. "Did you take him outside?" Henry followed her from room to room, trying to explain, but each explanation seemed to vanish before it reached her. Margaret opened the front closet and called Claire's name again. "She'll be frightened if she comes home and he's gone." Henry's restraint finally snapped. He struck his palm against the table hard enough to rattle the cups. "Claire is not coming home," Margaret recoiled. The fear in her face silenced him instantly. Henry stared at his own hand as though it belonged to someone he despised. Margaret sat slowly on the couch, confused and wounded, while he turned away, unable to apologize without admitting how completely he was falling apart. The trailer became still, emptied of paw steps, whining, and the small disturbances that had once irritated him. It felt less like a home than a room after a funeral. Then, through the snow and the closed door, Milo barked. Milo's bark came again through the storm, sharp and urgent against the silence inside the trailer. Ryan opened the truck door, but the puppy did not wait for the leash to be unclipped. He twisted free, landed in the snow, and raced toward the porch with Henry's scarf still caught between his teeth. Margaret opened the door just as Milo scratched frantically at the wood. He shot inside, leaped against her knees, and pressed his face beneath her hands as though proving he had returned from somewhere terrible. Margaret laughed and cried at once, calling him Claire's good boy while he covered her chin with desperate kisses. Then Milo stopped and looked across the room at Henry. Henry stood beside the table, his long face pale and unreadable. "You brought him back," he said. Ryan closed the door. "He brought me back." Henry's jaw tightened. The Mercers offered him a better home. Milo crossed the room. Henry stepped away, but the puppy followed. "No," Henry muttered, pushing gently against his chest. "You've got land waiting for you, a heated barn. People who can care for you." Milo refused to move. Near the doorway sat the canvas bag Henry had packed with food, toys, and Claire's old flannel shirt. Milo seized the strap, dragged the bag away from the door, then lay across the threshold like a living barricade. Margaret covered her mouth. Henry stared at the puppy with the helpless anger of a man watching his final defense collapse. "Move," Henry ordered. Milo lowered his head but stayed. When Henry reached for the bag, Milo rose and pressed his entire body against the old man's legs. Not playfully, not fearfully, deliberately. Snow melted from his black and tan coat onto Henry's trousers, and his uneven ears tilted back as he looked up. Henry's swollen hands hovered above him. For weeks he had avoided touching Milo unless necessary. Now, one hand sank slowly into the puppy's fur. Henry's knees gave way. He sat on the floor, and a small, broken sound escaped him. Milo climbed into his lap despite being too large and rested his head beneath Henry's chin. "Every time I look at him, I see her," Henry whispered. "Claire carrying him through that door. Claire laughing because his ear wouldn't stand." His shoulders shook. "But that isn't the worst part." He looked toward Margaret. "One day he'll look at me the way she does sometimes, polite, confused, like I'm a stranger in the wrong house." Ryan crouched nearby. "Milo doesn't need you to remember everything," he said. "He just needs you to still be here." Henry closed his eyes while Milo remained pressed against him. Ryan moved into the kitchen and began making calls. He did not simply pay the bills, knowing Henry would experience that as another private humiliation. First, he called Daniel Reeves, a 44-year-old former Marine from his old unit. Daniel was Burkina-stoled, dark-skinned, clean-shaven, and walked with a slight limp left by a roadside blast. The injury had ended his service and made him fiercely unwilling to let other veterans suffer alone. Daniel contacted the local Veterans Association. Ryan then called Grace Community Church, where Ruth Palmer answered. Ruth was a short, round-faced, 60-year-old widow with silver curls and bright blue eyes. After losing her husband young, she had turned grief into practical kindness and now managed the church's Winter Assistance Fund. Finally, Ryan reached Elena Martinez at County Senior Services. Elena was 35, with olive skin, straight black hair, and a patient, precise voice shaped by years of caring for her father after a stroke. By early afternoon, Daniel arrived with heating fuel and emergency grant forms. Ruth brought groceries, blankets, and volunteers who sealed the worst window gaps. Elena arranged meal support and a home safety assessment. Henry protested every bag and every form. His voice grew sharper until Margaret placed her hand over his. "I'm tired, Henry," she said. "I'm tired of pretending we're fine, so you don't feel ashamed." The room fell quiet. Henry looked at her trembling fingers, then at Milo sitting against his knee. At last he nodded. A utility crew restored the electricity shortly before dusk. The refrigerator coughed awake, the heater began pushing warm air, and the ceiling bulb flickered before glowing steadily. Milo jumped backward, stared up at the light, and barked at it with such offended suspicion that Margaret burst into laughter for the first time in weeks. For the next several weeks, winter settled heavily over the Lake Superior shoreline, covering the Dawson trailer in white and turning every morning into another small test of endurance. Ryan visited almost every day. He replaced loose siding, sealed the cracked windows, repaired the porch rail, and taught Milo simple routines that might help protect Margaret. The young German shepherd learned quickly. When Margaret became confused, Milo sat beside her instead of jumping. If the front door opened after dark, he barked twice and ran to Henry. When Margaret's breathing grew fast or her hands began to shake, Milo searched for Henry and tugged gently at his trouser leg. Henry claimed the training was unnecessary. He also complained that Milo ate like a horse, occupied the warmest place beside the heater, and snored like a tractor struggling uphill. Yet every night, after Margaret fell asleep, Henry crossed the living room and pulled an old blanket over the dog. Milo always opened one eye, but politely pretended not to notice. By the final week of December, Milo had grown taller and stronger. His chest had broadened. His paws no longer looked absurdly large, and both ears stood upright, except when he was tired. The puppy who had once watched Henry cautiously now followed him from room to room. Henry had begun speaking to him when he thought nobody could hear. "You already ate. That chair belongs to people. Stop looking at me like that." Ryan never mentioned these conversations. Some forms of affection survived only when they were allowed to remain disguised. The storm arrived after midnight. Wind rushed down from Lake Superior with enough force to shake the trailer walls, driving snow so thickly across the windows that the world outside disappeared. Henry had fallen asleep in his chair while waiting for Margaret to finish in the bedroom. His chin rested against his chest, one hand still holding an unread newspaper. Milo slept near the heater. Margaret woke sometime later believing it was a morning from years before. In her mind, Claire was 19 again and arriving by bus for Christmas. She dressed without turning on the bedroom light, wrapped herself in a thin wool coat, and opened the front door. The wind tore it from her hand. Milo woke instantly. He barked, raced toward the doorway, then turned and ran to Henry. The dog clawed at the old man's sleeve, whined, and struck his paws against Henry's knee until he woke. "What is it?" Henry muttered. Milo barked again and ran toward the open door. Cold air filled the trailer. Snow had already blown across the floor. Margaret was gone. Henry's face emptied. He stumbled outside without gloves, shouting her name into the storm. There was no answer, only wind and darkness. He called Ryan with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped the phone. Ryan arrived 15 minutes later in his recovery truck, emergency lights flashing red through the snow. He wore insulated work clothes beneath a heavy brown jacket, but the cold still cut through him the moment he stepped outside. Henry stood beside the trailer, pale and breathless, while Milo paced in tight circles near the porch. "She thinks Claire is at the bus stop," Henry said. "There's an old shelter down the road." Ryan looked toward the white emptiness. "How far?" "Less than half a mile." Snow was already erasing Margaret's tracks. Ryan attached a long lead to Milo's collar, knelt, and held out one of Margaret's gloves. Milo sniffed it once, then lowered his nose to the ground. He moved forward immediately. The three of them entered the storm. Henry struggled to keep pace, his boots sinking into the drifts while wind tore at his coat. Ryan stayed close enough to catch him when he slipped. Milo led them past a stand of frozen spruce, across the entrance to an abandoned campground, and toward a narrow county road. The tracks appeared and vanished beneath fresh snow, but Milo never hesitated for long. He circled whenever the scent weakened, then pulled forward again with renewed certainty. They found Margaret inside an abandoned bus shelter, leaning against a cracked plexiglass wall. Snow had blown through the missing door and gathered around her boots. Her face was pale, her lips nearly colorless, but her eyes were open. "Claire's late," she whispered when Henry dropped beside her. Milo broke free from Ryan's hand and pressed himself against Margaret's body. He curled across her legs, trapping warmth beneath his thick coat while licking her frozen fingers. Henry removed his jacket and wrapped it around both of them. At Marquette Regional Hospital, Margaret was treated for mild hypothermia. Dr. Samuel Grant, a 52-year-old emergency physician with dark skin, closely cropped gray hair, and calm hazel eyes, spoke with the measured patience of a man who had spent decades delivering frightening news without making families feel powerless. He told Henry they had found her in time, but another night like this could end differently. Margaret lay beneath heated blankets, tired but stable. She did not remember leaving the trailer. She looked at Henry, then Ryan, with embarrassed confusion. Milo stood beside the bed and rested his head near her hand. Margaret's fingers moved slowly into his fur. For several seconds, everyone waited. Then she smiled. "Milo," she whispered. Henry looked at Ryan across the hospital room. He finally understood that Milo had never been another burden inside their fragile home. The dog was one of the reasons the family had not yet fallen apart. The weeks after Margaret's rescue brought softer snow, brighter mornings, and a new rhythm to the Dawson trailer. Elena Martinez arranged for in-home assistance 3 days a week, and Sarah Mitchell arrived the following Monday carrying a medical bag, a notebook, and enough patience to survive Henry's suspicion. Sarah was 48, tall and slender, with fair, freckled skin, chestnut hair cut neatly at her shoulders, and steady green eyes that rarely judged what they saw. She had spent 15 years caring for her mother through dementia, an experience that had made her gentle without becoming fragile and practical without becoming cold. Henry insisted they did not need a stranger watching them. Sarah calmly replied that she was not there to watch them. She was there to help them keep living in their own home. Milo approved of her before Henry did, especially after discovering that her coat pocket contained small dog treats. The trailer changed slowly. Daniel Reeves and several local veterans replaced the damaged siding, reinforced the porch steps, and installed locks that sounded an alarm whenever the front door opened at night. Ruth Palmer organized neighbors from Grace Community Church to repair the roof, seal the windows, and fill the cupboards. People Ryan had once pulled from snowbanks or helped after roadside breakdowns arrived with lumber, tools, blankets, and food. Henry hated being the center of their attention, but he no longer ordered anyone to leave. Instead, he stood nearby, pretending to supervise, while Milo followed the workers and attempted to steal gloves. By the end of the month, the trailer no longer groaned whenever the wind struck it. Warm air remained inside. Yellow light filled the windows after sunset, and Margaret stopped sleeping beneath 3 coats. Henry also began attending a weekly support group for people caring for family members with Alzheimer's. He disliked the folding chairs, the weak coffee, and the expectation that everyone should discuss feelings before 8 in the morning. During his first meeting, he said only his name and complained that the coffee could remove paint. By the 4th week, he admitted that he sometimes became angry because fear embarrassed him. He learned to call Sarah when Margaret had a difficult morning and to ask Ryan for help before exhaustion turned into resentment. Henry never became comfortable with vulnerability, but he slowly stopped treating it like surrender. Ryan became part of the household without anyone formally inviting him. He ate dinner with the Dawsons every Sunday, repaired whatever Henry claimed did not need repairing, and continued Milo's training. The young German shepherd learned to remain beside Margaret when she became disoriented, alert Henry if she approached the door after dark, and retrieve a small pouch containing her identification and emergency information. Milo performed each task with solemn concentration until food appeared, at which point his military discipline disappeared completely. Henry still complained that the dog ate too much, shed enough fur to build another dog, and occupied the best place near the heater. Yet every evening, Milo's blanket was carefully straightened before Henry went to bed. Ryan changed as well. For years, he had believed life after the Marines meant remaining useful while keeping everyone at a safe emotional distance. The Dawson home taught him something different. Belonging did not always arrive through blood, marriage, or ceremony. Sometimes it appeared as a chair kept empty for Sunday dinner, an old man insulting the quality of his coffee, or a confused woman remembering that he liked extra syrup on his waffles. Ryan stopped feeling like a visitor long before he admitted it. On Christmas morning, fresh snow covered the repaired roof and gathered against the new porch rail. Inside, the trailer glowed with strings of warm lights Ruth had hung around the windows. The heater hummed steadily. Waffles browned in an iron on the counter, and Milo raced across the floor wearing a red ribbon that Henry claimed looked ridiculous. Margaret laughed whenever the ribbon slipped over one of his eyes. For a while, the morning was clearer to her. She remembered Christmas songs, recognized Claire's photograph, and told Ryan that he had put far too much whipped cream on his waffles. Then the certainty faded. Margaret looked across the table at him, her pale brown eyes polite but uncertain. "I'm sorry," she said. "Who are you?" Silence briefly touched the room. Ryan lowered his fork. But before sorrow could settle, Henry reached across the table and answered gently. That's the man who brought Milo home. Margaret looked at the German shepherd lying beside Ryan's chair. Something softened in her face. She reached across the table and took Ryan's hand. Then he must be family, she said. Henry looked down quickly, pretending to adjust Milo's ribbon. Ryan squeezed Margaret's hand and smiled without trying to hide what the words meant to him. Later, Milo stretched between Henry and Margaret beside the heater, his head resting on Henry's boot while one paw touched Margaret's slipper. Ryan sat across from them with a cup of coffee, no longer positioned near the door and no longer resembling a guest. Snow continued falling beyond the warm windows, covering the road and quieting the world. But for the first time in many years, nobody inside that little home had to face winter alone. Sometimes a miracle does not arrive with thunder, flashing light, or an answer that changes everything at once. Sometimes God sends a loyal dog, a stranger who chooses to stay, or a warm hand reaching across a table when life feels cold. In our daily lives, many people carry grief, fear, loneliness, and memories that are slowly fading. We may not be able to heal every wound, but we can still offer patience, kindness, and a place where someone feels safe. That may be the miracle they have been praying for. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of love, courage, and healing. May God protect you, bless your family, strengthen every tired heart, and place gentle light on every road you walk each day.